Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This last week, there was a general election in the UK, and some people have been asking me about some of the differences that we see in how that plays out versus how it does in Canada. And one of the most visible things is on the way election night plays out. Now, the way they do it in the UK is that they have centralized ballot counting. So instead of each poll counting and reporting results and that getting fed to Elections Canada, and that creates a rolling tally through the night, which is very dramatic, and so on. What they do instead is they have centralized counting areas, and then they report the constituency total all at once, which makes for a later night. But what they end up doing as part of that is this tradition where you have all of the candidates in that riding lining up on stage when the ballot is when the results are announced, and you will see they all have their little rosettes with their party colors. And then they're all, the writing results are announced at the same time, so everyone is present, and, it's one event. It's not, this kind of, sense of drama as you get individual polls. One of the things I really like about how the UK does this, though, is that, you need to make sure that you're in the room with with everyone else that you ran against. So it can enforce a bit of collegiality in that regard. And we do see instances, particularly in a lot of Canadian elections lately, where certain candidates just disappear once the election is called. They don't go to debates. They don't go to all candidate meetings. They don't do anything like that. And some of them don't even talk to the media. And this way they're all kind of visible and in the same place. And I also, some of you may have seen, was joking on Twitter that if we had this in 2011, it would have forced some of the NDP candidates like Ruth Ellen Brosseau or Lauren Liu or Charmaine Bourg to have actually visited the ridings that they were running in before they actually won. So hey, there's a bonus there as well. I also like that when you've got someone like the Prime Minister or important cabinet ministers running for re-election, that being on stage with all of the other candidates in the riding really kind of reinforces that, you are just an MP, just like everyone else. Yes, you may have a high office, but deep down, you are still an MP running like any other MP. And I think that makes a really kind of symbolic statement, but also it's kind of humbling. And it's especially so when you have, as the UK has developed this tradition, certain joke candidates who like to run in the ridings that the Prime Minister is. I think one of them is dubbed Lord Binface. There's usually someone in an Elmo costume. There are a couple of others as well. And again, that's just kind of humbling for the leaders that are running. And I think that's probably a good thing that they have it, and that, something we should be thinking about when we look at ways that we can change things in our own system as well. I think that's, I think it's an important symbolic element to how those elections are run, and how we should probably think about that as well. One of the other things that people have been mentioning in the last couple of days is the speed by which the transition of government has happened over there. The day after the election, the Prime Minister visited Buckingham Palace. I think it was at like 10 o'clock, and announced his intention to resign to the King. And by 11, Keir Starmer had made his visit to the palace and was invited to form a government. And then within the next day, he had a cabinet sworn in and was ready to meet. That does not happen nearly at all that fast in Canada. But there's a variety of reasons for that, one of which is geographic. For example, if you had a prime minister running in Calgary, as Stephen Harper did, making it to Ottawa to meet the Governor General the next morning at 10 o'clock is almost impossible, particularly if you have a very late election night where things go to 1 or 2 or even 3 o'clock in the morning, as they have on many an occasion. So just geography is part of that as well. What tends to happen in Canada is that they will swear in the Prime Minister and the entire cabinet all in at once. I'm not sure that's exactly what happened in this particular case either, but the thing that we need to remember is that cabinet formation in Canada is a much longer and more, I would say, almost precarious process, because since 1867 we've developed this convention by which cabinet is a federal institution. And what that means is that cabinet needs to have regional representation from all of the various provinces, as much as a government is able, as well as linguistic representation. And in more recent decades, we have included things like other kinds of diversity within cabinet, and Justin Trudeau has put gender balance in there as well. So in order to kind of create a cabinet which will meet the needs that you're looking for in terms of your portfolios, because different prime ministers will shape their cabinets differently in terms of adding departments or collapsing departments or merging them or whatnot. So those considerations, I would also mention that in the UK, they have a particular statutory scheme around the size of their cabinet and the positions they're in, which is not, well, you'll have commentators in this country talk about, look, they have a small cabinet, it's fixed, it's more serious. That obscures the fact that they have a ton of junior ministers in the UK, which also kind of subdivide a lot of the work from the main cabinet ministers. They do change their departments and stuff up as well, but not quite in the same way that Canada has a tendency to do. So yes, with this in mind, a Canadian Prime Minister will need to take a look at just who got elected, and sometimes if there's a person that he or she really wants to put into cabinet and their election is being contested, that has drawn things out. An example we saw of that in this last Canadian election was Pascal Saint-Onge. That had to go to a recount, and Trudeau had wanted her in cabinet, and so it delayed the whole process by weeks because of that. So you need to look at, or a Canadian Prime Minister needs to look at who's all in his caucus, because we have seen instances where certain regions are shut out. You need to look at who is, what your regional composition is going to be, and how many francophones and anglophones you have, so that you don't have something that's too distorted, which has been difficult for certain conservative prime ministers in recent years, where they have been largely shut out of Quebec or outside of particular regions in Quebec. That was one reason why Stephen Harper appointed Michael Fortier to the Senate in order to put him into cabinet, was because he didn't have anyone from the Montreal area, and he felt that that was important. In subsequent elections, he just decided to wash his hands of that altogether. But regardless, these are all considerations that a Canadian Prime Minister makes. So in order to ensure that you've got, people in portfolios you want, who meet your regional and gender dynamics, or other diversity dynamics and your linguistic dynamics, that becomes a much more fraught process to kind of slot people in. The UK cabinet really doesn't have a lot of these same considerations. They might have somewhat different regional considerations with Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, but that is vastly different from how you are dealing with 10 provinces and 3 territories when you are looking to build a Canadian cabinet. As well, because the UK is less concerned about these dynamics in their cabinet, their shadow minister system tends to mean that you have people who are in opposition, but basically preparing to form government at a moment's notice. And so their shadow ministers tend to have a lot more seriousness than critics in Canada, because they are essentially intended to take over the cabinet role on a moment's notice, like they did in this last few days here in the UK, or in this last UK election. But that's much harder to do in Canada, because if you have to build a cabinet with diverse regional content, or regional representation and linguistic representation, you don't know what your cabinet or what your caucus is going to look like after an election, because we tend to have fairly big swings in this country. So it's hard to know what that's going to look like to put people into place as a shadow minister beforehand, so they can kind of just cross the floor and assume that position as soon as possible. This is again just the quirks of how Canadian cabinets work, and so it makes it much harder. But I think it's also in Canada we have a much I would say opposition leaders tend to look for different things in who they choose as critics rather than they would in a cabinet minister. Basically, that they want critics who can be vocal and performative and who can get good media clips, whereas you want someone with a different skill set to be in cabinet, largely in terms of managerial prowess and so on. So that's one of the reasons in which Canada is a little less serious in that regard as well. But again, you've got all these different considerations that make it hard to think of these things in advance. And so that's one of the reasons why things get a lot more delayed in Canada. We also have particular issues around fairly draconian laws in terms around lobbying restrictions. So if you are trying to bring in outsiders to assist with, say, your government transition planning and so on, you need to find people for whom doing this work for you is not going to impede their ability to do other work for the next 2 or 5 years or whatever the period in the relevant sections of the lobbying legislation are going to be. That's also one of the reasons why cabinet ministers have a hard time attracting talent and to work in their offices, is because a lot of these people who have relevant experience would be hampered when they return to a professional life outside of that. And that's something that we often don't really think about, but it does become a problem in certain respects in Canada as well. So those are some of the differences. There are some others, but these are the main ones that we've been talking about over the last few days. And yeah, that's kind of how, or some of the how and why things play out in Canada differently. I think there are things we really should be learning about how the UK does things. On the other hand, the regional aspect of Canadian cabinets makes this a lot more difficult for us to do in a similar way, unless we want to completely forgo that particular consideration after 150 some years, but that may be that may be particularly difficult to do. Recall when in his first parliament, Justin Trudeau tried to forgo having a Quebec lieutenant and saying that he's a Quebec MP, so he's a Quebec general. And that didn't essentially fly as well, and he wound up appointing a Quebec lieutenant position after the next election. And so these are how some of these things play out, and why Canada winds up being different in that regard. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.